Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at another short Latin story. Now this one is called A Retort, and it comes from Easy Latin Stories for Beginners, which is a book by George L. Bennett from the late 1800s. If you've seen any of the videos I've put in this series, you know that what Bennett is calling Easy Latin Stories for Beginners are not really that easy, and they're also not really for beginners. So I always say that the best bet for this would be to use it if you're in probably like a Latin 2 or 3. That's usually where I aim it for my own students. Part one of his stories are really more at that sort of Latin 2-ish range, I would say. Once you get past that, you start to get into a little more complicated Latin, things like subjunctive that you just haven't really seen at an early stage in Latin. So I would say if you're a student, start in the first part of these stories, try to see if you understand them. If you ever run across a story that you just don't get or the grammar looks completely screwy, maybe back off and just find a different one, because it is kind of hard to find one that your suitable level. For teachers, again, I would say probably at that Latin 2, 3 range, these stories are really well suited for that. Now, the reason I like Bennett is because his stories are all really based on either history or maybe philosophy or culture of ancient Greek and Romans, and they're really, really great for breaking free from a traditional curriculum. So if you're looking for something new, something different that you've never read before, these are awesome, and they're also great springboards to help you kind of launch into different areas of the ancient world. This one in particular is on philosophy, which we'll dive into. So again, reading this might kind of expose you to something that you just wouldn't find in a normal textbook. So I think they're great ways to break out. They're short, they're pretty straightforward. They're just a nice way to do something different. Okay, so like I said, this video is about Greek philosophy. So specifically, rather, it's about Aristippus, a student of Socrates. Okay, so his view is about pleasure being the ultimate goal of life. This later becomes, I think it's called ethical hedonism, but that style of philosophy. But his famous phrase or saying is, "I possess, I am not possessed." Right? Even I remember that learning that in school, and I'm not the biggest fan of philosophy, right? But it kind of highlights this idea that seeking pleasure, it has to fall within the bounds of ethics, right? So he's a really interesting philosopher. In this story, you're going to get a glimpse into him as a teacher, as he's approached, by a father looking to have someone teach a young man. Again, philosophy is not at all my strong suit. So if you're interested in this stuff, I would say use it as a springboard, right? Maybe look him up, do some research on your own, but I'd encourage you to go searching for it for yourself. It might be something that you really enjoy, maybe you've never heard of, so kind of use it for that, okay? But for the video itself, the first thing we're going to do is I'll read it to you just so you can hear it one time. Again, not that my pronunciation is anything fantastic, but I'll read it through for you. And then I'll pause the video and I'll go through it line by line and help you kind of translate and understand what's happening here. I would say if you're really trying to understand the Latin, you might want to do a pre-read and just get some of the vocab, right? If you see any vocab you don't understand, just quickly look it up. That way you're not kind of getting stuck in that way. I'd also recommend that you read it aloud, right? So if you can find someone to read it to, just practice your speaking, your pronunciation. It's always good. And if you find a classmate or a partner, they can read it back to you, and that way you're working on your listening skills too. All those things are awesome. They're great ways to really understand what's going on. And again, if you really want to dive into it, try the read and reread method, where you just kind of repeat reading the story over and over again and fixing any mistakes along the way until you can read it all the way through and understand it completely. That's how you know you're always in a good spot. Okay? But to start, let me read it to you, and then we'll unpack it. So the story goes like this. Venit olim, quidam ad Aristippum philosophum aeque dixit. Vis ne filium meam artes tuas docere? Respondit Aristippus. Hoc equidem faciam acceptis duobus talentis. Pater autem pretio exteritus dixit. At serum minoris emere possum. Contra Aristippus. Fac hoce ita duos servos habebus. Okay, so let's pause the video there. Again, if you haven't done the work on your own of reading it and translating it, stop here, go do it. But for the rest of the video, let's kind of unpack it a couple of lines at a time and see what's going on here, okay? So it starts like this. You have olim, right? Once upon a time. Everyone would do that. But you have a certain man came to Aristippus, the philosopher, right? Venit ad Aristippum philosophum. So he came to Aristippus, the philosopher, and he said to him, aeque dixit, right? He said, do you wish? And again, the any on vis just means you're asking a yes or no question. So it's really vis. He says, do you wish to teach, docere, do you wish to teach my son artes tuas, your arts or your skills, however you want to kind of translate artes there, right? Basically, do you want to teach him your philosophy is kind of the idea. So he says, do you want to teach my son, right? He's approaching him for a job. Now, Aristippus responds, right? You have responded Aristippus. And this is one of the things when I was just doing a little bit into Aristippus, apparently he charged money for his philosophy, which is different. I didn't actually realize, Greek philosophers would charge money. I always think of Socrates and not doing that. But apparently he did. So there you go. Something to kind of look up for philosophy. So he responds and he says, I will do this, right? Hoc equidem faciam. He says, I will do this acceptis duobis talentis, right? Having accepted 2 talents. Or you might even say like upon receiving 2 talents. So he's talking about money, right? He says you have to pay me, and if you pay me 2 talents, then of course I'll tutor your child. Now, you might not be familiar with the word talentis there. It's kind of a tricky one. And I'll say I'm not an expert on this, but talent is a talent rather, is a Greek unit of weight, right? So it has to do with money and an amount of usually silver, I think, but I think it could also be gold and even copper, if I remember right. But this is probably talking about silver. And it's this defined amount of money, and if I remember right, it would kind of vary over, the course of time and kind of what standard you're weighing it with. But it's basically money, right? So the value of it's probably beyond me. I think it kind of changes a lot. There might be something that kind of tells you. I feel like if I remember right, it might have been somewhere around like 50 pounds. I might be off on that, but it's basically a unit of measure. Okay, so when he says 2 talents, that's a lot of money, right? So he's saying you gotta, you gotta pay me if you want me to teach your son. So that's what he means when he says, acceptis duobus talentis. He's like, yeah, if you want to pay me, I'll teach your kid. So that's what he's talking about here. So talentis might be a word you're not totally familiar with, but that's it. It's just sort of a way of measuring. It's an amount of money. It's kind of the idea. Okay. So he says, I'll teach your son if you pay me. Then you have pater autem pretio exterritus dixit. So you have the father, however, he's kind of terrified by the price, pretio exterritus, right? He's thrown off by this. He's like, wait, that much money? And again, 2 talents is, if I remember right, a lot of money. So he said, what? And he says, at serva minoris embre possum. He says, but I'm able to buy a slave for less money, right? So he's like, why would I give you that much? I can buy a slave, right? Maybe buy a slave to tutor my kid. Okay. So he's kind of thrown off by the amount of money that Aristippus is asking for. And he's like, no, there's no way I'll pay you that much. And this is why the story's called a retort, because Aristippus is about to have a really kind of clever line to counter what the dad just said. And he counters it, you have contra Aristippus, right? So Aristippus said in reply, contra. But this is his sort of quip. He says, fac hoce ita duos servos habebis. He says, go ahead, fac hoce, right? Do this, right? Go ahead, buy a slave. And then he says, thus, right, ita, he says, you will have 2 slaves, okay? So he's saying if you buy 1 to teach your kid, you're going to have 2. And it's a clever way of saying your son will turn into a slave because they're not going to be set free by their education. It's kind of the way I interpret this. And he's saying, yeah, go ahead, right? If you want to have a terrible, someone other than me try to teach your kid, good. He'll only learn from a slave, and your son will turn into a slave in turn. And he probably means like a slave of the mind is what he's getting at. So it's a clever retort and just a fun little story. Again, it's not particularly long, but a little glimpse into Aristippus. Again, I would be lying if I said I know a lot about this man, because again, philosophy is not my thing. But if you're interested in ancient philosophy, Greek philosophy, use this as a springboard, right? Like I said, go dive into it, have fun. And if you do know a lot about philosophy and want to enlighten the group, feel free to put it in the comments below, because it is beyond me. But again, if you're just trying to work through this and learn some Latin, it's a fun little story. It's not too bad, the grammar, and it should be something you can handle pretty well. Again, depending on the level you're at, but just something to break free. This is not the type of story you'd usually see in a Latin textbook, so it's kind of fun to read something different. All right? If you have any questions at all or anything you need, just put it in the comments below. I'm always happy to help you. But otherwise, just keep reading it. And if you're able to, hit a point where you can read through this and understand it, that's how you know you're ready to move on. Good luck.